you all for being here. This is only my second year at MTSU, so I'm still kind of getting the lay of the land, and I was really excited last year to find out about this brown bag series, and extra excited to make my little contribution here today. But I figured I should probably start with a little bit of a confession, which is that my research interests maybe have more to do with popular sound, broadly conceived, than they do with popular music in particular. For instance, today I'll be talking about podcasts, which is a popular digital audio format I assume that most, if not all of you, have heard of at this point. But just in case you all aren't familiar, and as a way of bringing music into this conversation here, I wanted to start by playing a very short episode of The EP, which is a recent podcast from the New York Times.
Track 4. Greens, Beans, Blessings. Greg Howard and Shirley Caesar's Hold My Mule. Okay, so what happens this year is that a tiny snippet of an old recording gets turned into something completely new and different.
Yeah.
But the whole thing sort of originates with a woman named Shirley Caesar.
Right. Shirley Caesar is a gospel singer. You know, she'll sing, you know, but she also, would you call it preaching?
So she's, okay, so it's called Hold My Mule.
Yeah.
And it's a story about a man who his church tells him that he is jumping and shouting too much. And they come to his farm to tell him to be less demonstrative in church.
About his love for Christ.
Yeah. And he responds by showing them his farm and saying, look how blessed I am. How could I not celebrate?
Look at all these blessings. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's the list of blessings is the important part.
Beans, greens, potatoes, tomatoes, lambs, rams, hogs, dogs, chicken, turkeys, rabbits. You name it!
Yeah.
DJ Suede on Twitter as Remix God Suede. He remixed Hold My Mule, but he specifically lifted this list of, and then puts the trap beat over it.
When the remix god Suede posted this for his internet following, he set this up for people to do what they would with it. The You Name It challenge. Maybe you want to make a video of yourself dancing, singing along, throwing a verse over, whatever it is that you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think brings us to the rapper Gray, who ended up with, I thought was the best rendition of the You Name It challenge. Gray is he's a rapper, but he's also, and maybe more importantly, he's a vegan. He rapped over the beat. And then he goes,
we should actually note that he's in his car.
Yeah.
Dramatically moving his phone to create like the visual impact of like a rap video.
Right.
Quick cuts and like everything sort of like, but it's just a man in the front seat of his car.
He's having the time of his life. He's completely alone in the car. But like he might just like his man might be in the Whole Foods picking up, you know, these beans, you know, these greens and stuff. And he's just so excited for Thanksgiving and like, you know, when you're talking about like the joy and like reveling in the Lord that was going on at church and in black church and the singing and the dancing and stuff. You know, it was uplifting in similar ways. It seems like the end point, look how blessed I am, basically. Look, you know, I'm about to really feast. They get to the same point.
So as you get a little bit of a sense of there, each episode of this podcast features an interviewee talking about a particular song, and they cover everything from Kanye West to Adele to Leonard Cohen. But there's a reason that I chose this particular episode, and it's because there's a lot of genres involved in the metamorphosis that happens to the song Hold My Mule over these 3.5 minutes. There's gospel, there's trap music, there's rap. And while I could talk for a while about genre, the episode also highlights the way that format matters. I'll come back to this a little later on, but for the moment, my point is that it matters that DJ Suede could circulate his version of Shirley Caesar's song on social media as a remixable digital audio file, and that somebody like Gray could post his version as a digital video. while they both obviously used a lot of technology to create their versions, they didn't have to have their own recording studios at their disposal. And I'm sure that DJ Sway does have thousands of dollars of mixing equipment, but, and no offense to him, someone with consumer-grade audio editing equipment at this point could make something fairly similar to what he created there. And that's part of what has helped podcasts become ubiquitous. A lot of people are making them with no more than a couple $100s worth of equipment, in some cases using nothing more than the built-in mic on a computer or a smartphone and some free editing software. And so even if that might make some experienced audio engineers groan, this ability to create audio that way, then compress it and circulate it as an M4A or an MP3 file, this is indispensable to the kind of projects that I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to touch on a few of my projects, all related to my broader interest in podcasting, in part because, like I said, I'm kind of new here, so trying to give sort of a broad swath of my work a little time. So I don't want to take for granted, since I am new once again, that these areas of study where I'm kind of situated are familiar to everybody here. So I'm going to take a quick minute to work through them, but since I also don't want to bore you all with this, I'm going to try to keep it fairly brief in case you do already know what I'm talking about. So the field that I call home is rhetoric and writing, which is an established area in English studies. So that field has a long history, but its modern version kind of got started in the late 1800s when faculty at Harvard University started panicking that their students didn't know how to write anymore. So they hired a journalist named Adams Sherman Hill to come in and deal with this perceived problem. And sort of what we've come to know as the first-year writing or the first-year composition course was born. Then rhetoric and writing gathered a lot more steam in the 1960s and 70s with the open admissions movement, which led colleges and universities to admit much more diverse student bodies. And so a lot of writing teachers were interested in the challenges that came with this really diverse academic and personal backgrounds that these groups of students were bringing to classrooms. But they didn't want to take this kind of hyperbolic, like, my students can't write attitude that you still see in New York Times op-eds and Time magazine articles and things like that. So these writing teachers set out to study students' writing processes and their learning habits and all of their nuance and their complexity. And this pedagogical research helped generate professional organizations and academic journals and conferences and all the other trappings that we kind of associate with academic disciplines. Now, since then, this field of rhetoric and writing has become a lot more wide-ranging. It includes research on everything from workplace communication to political rhetoric to how digital technologies affect people's writing practices and so on. And there's also been a lot of collaboration with people in communication studies and also with colleges of education along the way. But in recent years, a lot of, well, at least a handful of rhetoric and writing scholars have started drawing on an interdisciplinary field called sound studies. And I'm part of that handful, so sound studies is the second area that I want to foreground here. Now this is from Jonathan Stern's Introduction to the Sound Studies Reader, which is an anthology that came out in 2012. I just want to read through this quickly. So, sound studies is the name for the interdisciplinary ferment in the human sciences that takes sound as its analytical point of departure or arrival. By analyzing both sonic practices and the discourses and institutions that describe them, it redescribes what sound does in the human world, and what humans do in the sonic world. It can begin from obviously sonic phenomena like speech, hearing, sound technologies, architecture, art, or music. It may think sonically as it moves underwater, through the laboratory or in the halls of government, considers religion or nationalisms old and new, explores cities, tarries with the history of philosophy, literature, or ideas, or critiques relations of power, property, or intersubjectivity. So there's a lot going on in this little quote, but suffice it to say that sound studies can and does draw on sociology, psychology, cultural studies, ethnomusicology, phenomenology, literature, physics, and as Stern notes explicitly later on, rhetoric. To provide just two examples of scholarship that's been gathered under this heading of sound studies, you can consider Stern's book, MP3, The Meaning of the Format, which tracks the rise and influence of the MP3, or sound artist Salome Vogelin's Listening to Noise and Silence Towards a Philosophy of Sound Art. In rhetoric and writing, meanwhile, one piece that is noteworthy and engages sound studies is Steph Sarasso's 2016 article, Re-Educating the Senses, which I've got a quote from that here. So in that piece, she draws on interviews she conducted with Dame Evelyn Glennie, who's a deaf percussionist, to conceptualize sound as a multisensory experience that's not just heard by the ear, but that's felt by the body. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to work through a few of my own projects that sit at this intersection of rhetoric and writing and sound studies. But there's a broad argument that kind of connects all these projects, and it's that we should take sonic and aural media seriously, not just as objects or trends to be critiqued and analyzed, but as means of producing and circulating scholarship. In other words, we should make audio scholarship. And I'm not sure how provocative that argument sounds to this particular audience gathered here, but I'm going to take a few minutes to sort of describe the experiences that brought me to this conclusion. And I want to say as a disclaimer that I think it's safe to say that I know like more about audio editing than like 90% of English professors, but probably less than 90% of the undergraduates in the recording industry program here. So when I play some samples for my work, this is not like me showing off my technical prowess. This is just trying to open up some possibilities. So treat me charitably if you don't mind. Anyway, a little over 5 years ago, I was starting my PhD, and I was working in a unit called the Digital Writing and Research Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. That lab was staffed totally by graduate students, mostly literature and rhetoric students, and each academic year we would be divided into small groups, and we would work on a particular digital humanities project focused on writing. In my second year in that lab, our coordinator decided that we should do a podcast about rhetoric and technology. Now, when I was an undergraduate, I spent 1 year as a music business major before I switched to English, so I knew like just enough about audio engineering to be dangerous, and so for that reason I ended up being the project leader for this podcast, which we ended up naming Zeugma, and we produced a 10-episode season that included episodes on internet trolling, the sharing economy, and how myths spread online. And when I listen back to it now, like, you can kind of tell it's a bunch of humanities graduate students trying to figure out like how in the world to work with audio, but I at least like to think that we had some fun along the way and generated a few segments that are hopefully thought-provoking and a little bit insightful. But as I got closer to the end of my PhD, I decided I wanted to create a similar project that I'd be able to take with me when I left Texas. That project became Rhetoricity, which is a podcast I started a couple years ago. At present, I'm about 25 episodes in. I have a little over 14,000 total downloads. And while I'm starting to get a little bit more experimental, at this point most of the episodes feature interviews with rhetoric and writing scholars. And of course, I want to say interviews, they've been a feature of scholarly journals even for a long time, so there's not necessarily anything new going on here. But what I have tried to do along the way is make use of sound to complement and enhance these interviews, constantly asking myself things like, what would this concept this person is discussing sound like? How can I illustrate the project that they're describing with audio? So to give you some sense of this, I'm going to play a couple short clips from 2 different episodes. The first is from the beginning of an episode where I interviewed Steph Sarasso, whose work I mentioned just a minute ago. So because she's interested in how sound interacts with other senses and experience, I asked her to start off this interview by inviting listeners to pay attention to their surroundings and other aspects of their listening experience. I edited this episode and I used some clips from the website freesound.org, plus a short little clip from a Charles Mingus song, to create a soundscape that framed this invitation that she was extending. So that's what I'm going to play for you here.
Instead of thinking of this podcast as sonic content for you to consume through your ears, consider it as a situated experience. As you're listening, think about how these sounds are making your body feel, whether you're in a car or walking with earbuds on the street.
Strolling through the park on a lovely but lonely afternoon.
Try to be aware of how these sounds are shaping your experience of the environment that you're inhabiting right now, or how the environment is affecting your responses to the sounds or your specific listening behaviors. Just thinking about listening as an experience rather than sound as content for you to consume.
So The other clip that I want to play here, partly because it incorporates music, is from an interview with Casey Boyle, who's an assistant professor at the University of Texas. And just to provide some quick context, this episode focuses on an article he wrote about glitch art, which is an art form in which technological errors get exploited as a way of challenging people to think differently about their relationships with technology. For instance, glitch artists have taken circuit boards and like speak and spells, those like old things that you like pull the arm and the arrow would spin and the cow goes moo, and rewired the circuit boards so that these devices perform and behave differently. Others take digital audio files and open them up in text editors and then play around with the file in that format and then see what happens when they export it back and reopen it as a music file. So to create just like a quick example of this for this episode, I opened up Iggy and the Stooges' Search and Destroy as in a text editor and played around with it and combined it, copied and pasted bits with a cover of that same song by an artist named Peaches. And so just a quick clip there of what that ends up sounding like so you get a little bit of a sense of how glitch art can operate. Amateur glitch art in this case. So a little bit of cacophony there for you. But again, that was just opening up those two files with text editors, taking chunks from one, copying and pasting them into another, and resulting in this like weird sort of mashup thing. But beyond that, the main clip I want to play is a little bit longer, and it features Casey Boyle talking about the way humanities scholars in particular tend to subdivide theory and practice. And basically, he argues we still tend to think of these two as relatively different kinds of work and really distinct steps in the research process, but that glitch art gives us a way to think about the ways theory and practice are really intertwined more than we typically realize. So as you'll hear, that's one of the key arguments in a book he has coming out soon. So anyway, as I edited this section, I used audio editing software to create and splice in two just short little melodic phrases. I paired one of them with the word theory, one of them with the word practice, and tried to use them to illustrate the points that Dr. Boyle was making in this interview. And some of you might recognize those phrases, especially once they come together here. But the clip I'm going to play starts right after I ask him about the way that he's trying to challenge this theory-practice relationship in his work.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it actually, I mean, since then the glitch article has become the heart of the book, really, and you're really getting at the question that I'm pursuing in the book, right? Is the relationship between theory and practice, and I think in rhetoric, anyways, it's a long history of not having an object to work against, right? It is folded into that as well, so. Rhetorical practices as knowledge we do and how it involves humans and non-humans, I think, is something that glitch gives us a particularly good sort of model for thinking through rhetoric as an ongoing exercise or practice. And that includes rhetorical theory. Rhetorical theory itself, what makes it different from other kinds of theory, I think, is the fact that it can never not question its situation. It's always kind of practical. It's always emergent. It's always contingent on a particular kind of event, right? And a lot of us who work in rhetorical theory say those kinds of things, but then the next step comes is like, okay, well, what does that mean, right? And for me, pursuing glitch and glitch art, and also the wider project itself, for which the glitch is only one sort of model in there, is to rethink theory and practice not as separate, but as a continuous motion. Deleuze has this really great line when he's in this interview with Michel Foucault, where Deleuze says, you know, we're in a new relationship between theory and practice, and he looks at them not so much as oppositions, but as relay points. It's where, you know, theory and practice kind of work together back and forth to kind of perpetuate a different kind of motion, right? And so rather than thinking back and trying to situate, theory as something that happens away from a material situation, it's much more the case where theory is just a kind of relationship within, always going to be within and situated within a material condition, right? A milieu. So the larger project itself tries to rethink theory and practice through and I'm pulling this from Gilbert Simondon, a technology theorist from a few decades ago, what he would call a transductive kind of operation. And a transductive operation, basically what that means is where a signal of some sort travels from one milieu to another milieu, right? And that could be theory practice, it could be different kinds of practices, right? And the idea there is to rethink practice, less as something distinct from theory, but as something that theory also is, right? Theory is a practice. It's the practice of theories, and it takes practice to do theory, right?
Yeah.
And so looking at them as being distinct or separate, I think it undermines both.
So those, and by the way, that was just me creating the Radiohead song "No Surprises" with like the cheesy like Hammond B3 organ patch in Apple's GarageBand, and a cheesy drum loop to go along with it. But those two clips hopefully give you some sense of what I'm trying to do with this podcast. Not just recording and distributing traditional kinds of respectable scholarly discourse in an audio format, but using sound to try to do things that traditional forms of written or spoken scholarship can't. But of course, to claim that projects meant for ears can or should count as a kind of scholarly production is kind of, at least in my disciplinary neck of the woods, a little bit controversial. And so for that reason, I tried to start looking for precedents that could help me situate and justify what I was doing, which brings me to the second project I'm going to talk about, which focuses on early 20th century radio plays written by literary critic Walter Benjamin. So nowadays, Benjamin's probably best known for his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and for his affiliation with the Frankfurt School, which is a group of German academics, many of whom were Jewish and who were exiled or fled Germany during the build-up to World War II. And some of them ended up in the U.S., where they had a major influence on the rise of cultural studies in the States. Benjamin tragically died in the midst of his own attempt to make it to the U.S. He was stopped in Spain, and learning he was likely going to be deported back to Nazi-occupied France, committed suicide in September 1940. But a decade earlier, Benjamin had found work writing, producing, and helping perform radio pieces for stations in Berlin and Frankfurt. And there are no audio recordings of these pieces that survived, but the scripts that Benjamin worked on were gathered and translated into English in a 2017 collection called Radio Benjamin, which the cover from that is what's on the left here. So a lot of those pieces are stories and plays meant for children. There's things about like the flooding of the Mississippi River, other kind of historical events from Europe and the United States. Others offer summaries of German intellectual history that are aimed at adults. One of my favorites is entitled A Pay Raise, Whatever Gave You That Idea? And it just offers workers strategies for negotiating raises with their employers, and it's an interesting kind of artifact to read through with Benjamin's Marxist convictions in mind. But that said, in her introduction to this collection, the editor, Alicia Rosenthal, notes that Benjamin didn't really hold his radio work in super high regard, referring to it simply as the work I do to earn a living, as opposed to his uncompensated critical writing, which he took more seriously. But despite his dismissive attitude toward his own work, Benjamin wasn't totally critical of radio itself. So this is a quote from Rosenthal's introduction. Benjamin's more hopeful affirmative comments on the politics and potential of radio, along with his broadcasts themselves, project a future for radio that would be built from a broader base, one that would be governed not by the selection of the interests of capital or the established networks of power, but by a more chaotic, unpredictable stream of voices. And I want to riff on Benjamin's hopeful affirmative comments, as Rosenthal calls them, with two lines of argument. First, that podcasting potentially resonates with this future for radio projected by Benjamin. And second, that both his radio work and its 21st century echoes speak to ongoing concerns in the areas of rhetoric and sound studies, as well as debates about the limits of what we call critique. So I'll turn now to expanding on these two claims, and along the way I'm going to provide a little bit more background on podcasts themselves. So it was exactly 70 years after Benjamin's last radio piece was broadcasted that podcasts hit the digital airwaves. So in 2003, the premiere episode of what was arguably the first podcast was made available for download by a journalist named Christopher Lydon. And writing about this new format in 2004, a reporter named Ben Hammersley remarked, "With the benefit of hindsight, it all seems quite obvious. MP3 players like Apple's iPod in many pockets, audio production software cheap or free, and weblogging an established part of the internet, all the ingredients are there for a new boom in amateur radio." So in short, this cluster of technologies let amateurs record themselves talking about everything from current events to food to popular culture, then upload the recording to the internet as a digital audio file. And as we all know all too well now, this in turn allowed others to download the file, usually for free for playback on an MP3 player or a computer. And of course, in the years that followed, podcasts have proliferated and diversified alongside the technologies that supported them. Podcasting became the territory not just of journalists, but of gutter punks and of comedians and eventually academics. So the Pew Research Center's State of the News Media 2016 report found that 21% of Americans 12 or older say they've listened to a podcast in the past month, which reflects steady growth since 2013 when that was at 12%. Now, I don't want to say that podcasting is a utopian endeavor, but I do think it realizes some of the positive potential that Benjamin saw in radio. Increasingly affordable and accessible technologies have allowed a broader base to create and share audio compositions. And of course, established institutions like Apple and National Public Radio have a great deal of influence on how podcasts are created and conceived and conceptualized and circulated. But I want to suggest to anyone who remembers the stranglehold that Clear Channel had on radio in the late 90s and early 2000s that podcasting has at least facilitated a slightly more chaotic, unpredictable stream of voices than some recent trends in commercial radio. But as I suggested earlier, I'm not just interested in podcasts as a curious phenomenon for scholars to study. I'm also interested in their practical possibilities for the creation and distribution of scholarship. And in some ways that puts me at odds with scholars in rhetoric and sound studies who see these fields as essentially critical or theoretical. So, for example, there's a 2013 article called Auscultating Again, Rhetoric and Sound Studies, and that's become a really influential piece for rhetoric scholars who draw on sound studies. Now, the writers of that essay survey a number of recently published sound studies anthologies, and they emphasize Jonathan Stern's sound studies reader, which I mentioned earlier. And they do so because they say its decidedly critical humanities bent will be recognizable to people who study rhetoric. And on a related note, I want to hop back quickly to Jonathan Stern's introduction to that anthology because he does explicitly link sound studies directly with critical modes of scholarship. Sound studies has an essential critical element in the broadest sense of critique. It may also take on characteristics of a producer, policy, technical, political, artistic, or training discourse. But without critique, it is art, technical discourse, science, cultural production, or training practices about sound, and not sound studies, though such work will often be of great interest to sound students. So Stern's focus on critique here isn't particularly surprising. After all, critique's been a staple of humanities and social science research for decades. But recently, critique has started attracting a few discontents. For example, in a book called The Limits of Critique, literary theorist Rita Felsky questions what she calls critique's rhetoric of againstness. She doesn't advocate a wholesale abandonment of critique, but she argues for post-critical approaches. In brief, her argument goes like this. Established critical methods, like Marxist criticism, for example, have started functioning like a meat grinder. You put your object in one end, you turn the crank, and voila, it comes out the other end looking the same way, similarly problematic every time. As Felsky puts it, the worldview of the critic is neither shaken nor stirred. What a text ultimately portends is foretold by a prior theoretical analytical scheme. So stated generally, the claim here is that critiques become too constrained and constraining. It doesn't allow for certain emotional stances, it isn't critical enough, or it's too insular, suspicious, or ineffectual when it comes to translating into sort of public arenas. Again, this is a quick gloss, and I'm myself still a little bit on the fence about parts of this post-critical conversation. But considering Felsky's argument led me to a conviction about which I'm a little less ambivalent. Given rhetoric's long-standing ties to artful invention, as well as critical discourse, rhetoricians have been explicitly and implicitly questioning critique's limits for centuries. I mean, you go back as far as Aristotle, and rhetoric has been providing systems for inventing arguments, not just frameworks for critiquing them or breaking them down. To put it in Stern's vocabulary, rhetoricians are quite aware that categories like art and critique and technical discourse tend to run together. And this tendency has been amplified by the kinds of technologies that podcasts have made podcasts possible. For example, in a 2006 article, rhetoric scholars Thomas Rickert and Michael Salvo draw on this figure of the prosumer, this hybrid like producer-consumer who's been linked with the rise of new media. And they try to make the case for blurring distinctions between what they call art and not art. So Rickert and Salvo position software like GarageBand, the audio editing program that was first released by Apple in 2004, as the latest step in the development of prosumer culture, where every act of consumption will in turn be an act of production. And I emphasize this article because it's a specific example of a sound-oriented rhetoric project that troubles these boundaries between art and not art, critical and creative work. So in this piece, and they had Pro Tools, Rickert and Salvo include sound files that they encourage readers or listeners to engage in tandem with their written arguments. So like Rickert and Salvo, rhetoricians interested in sound have frequently pushed critical conventions by incorporating an array of genres and methods and media and discourses into their scholarship. In fact, I'd argue that given rhetoric's long history as both this inventive art and critical theoretical tradition, it's distinctly positioned to trace and complicate some of these boundaries between creative and critical work, both across the fields of rhetoric and sound studies as well as sort of at other disciplinary intersections. That said, I want to be careful not to overstate the novelty and possibilities of sound-based scholarship as a way of blurring these boundaries, which brings me back to Radio Benjamin and a reassessment of my own podcasting work. So when my copy of this book came in the mail, it was the same time that I was kind of getting into this post-critical conversation and exploring sound work in rhetorical studies. And it was within that kind of scholarly ambience that I cracked the anthology's cover and read this claim on the book jacket. This eclectic collection demonstrates the range of Benjamin's thinking and his enthusiasm for popular sensibilities, his celebrated enlightenment for children youth programs, his plays, readings, book reviews, and fiction reveal Benjamin in a creative rather than critical mode. And I got fixated on that creative critical distinction at the end of this quote here. What to make of this claim that Benjamin, who's one of the most influential figures in the history of what English studies and cultural studies have come to call critique or criticism, was here working in a creative rather than critical mode? And what was it that made this so? Was it that he was engaging popular sensibilities? Was it that he had a really broad audience? Wasn't there at least like a tinge of critique around the edge of these scripts? Not to mention a tinge of creativity around the edges of Benjamin's critical essays? And if not, did that leave Benjamin's radio scripts fit only for analysis by other scholars rather than a potential source of inspiration for scholars? So in another situation, I might have decided, like, I'm just overthinking a blurb from a book jacket, just leave it alone. But because Benjamin's had his own commitment to what other people would deem ephemeral or sort of insignificant artifacts, I stuck with it, and I arrived at a conviction and a concern. And I've mentioned both of these already, but I want to restate them here given their importance to the work I'm talking about. The conviction, again, is that audio scholarship, not just critical scholarship about audio or sonic texts, but scholarship published as audio, is a fruitful medium for tracing and troubling this creative critical boundary, and that rhetoric scholars are particularly equipped for such work. My concern was that the creativity of audio scholarship, whether it's a podcast or something else, is easily and pretty frequently overstated. The issue, I think, is primarily one that has to do with medium. Because critical scholars, generally speaking, used to the norms of written discourse, anything done in a sonic medium can just seem inherently creative. This is what I'd argue is happening in the case of this book jacket. It's a conflation of the relative novelty of sonic broadcast media with an inherent creativity on the part of works that are composed for and published using such media. And that's not to say that a critical writer departing from sort of written text isn't exercising a certain amount of creativity, but I feel like if decades of these like hackneyed radio talk shows have taught us anything, taking to the airwaves does not automatically qualify you as a creative or uncritical person. So all that to say, I wasn't totally sure what to do with all of this, so I decided to take an experimental approach. So for my presentation at the Rhetoric Society of America conference last year, which is one of our larger professional conferences, instead of presenting the sort of 20-minute paper that's still the norm for conferences, at least in my field, I decided to stage and record a live performance of one of Benjamin's radio plays. So in the months leading up to this conference, I considered a few of the pieces in this collection. Eventually, I settled on a radio play that's called Lichtenberg, A Cross Section. So this script was commissioned by Radio Berlin in 1932, and it was submitted by Benjamin in 1933, but it never actually got produced due to the rise of the Nazi Party. Its subject is George Christoph Lichtenberg, an 18th century German scientist and satirist whose posthumously published notebooks influenced everybody from Nietzsche to Freud. And the basic plot of the script, which is kind of weird, is basically there's a bunch of creatures who live on the moon, and they're studying Earth, and they're trying to determine whether humans can ever amount to anything. And they decide to select Lichtenberg as their test subject. So the rest of the radio play alternates between the deliberations of these moon beings and little vignettes from Lichtenberg's life. And I selected it for two primary reasons. First, half of it takes place at what is basically an academic conference on the moon, so it was a nice kind of resonance for the venue where I'd be presenting it and making the recording. And second, because it's kind of divvied up into these little moments from Lichtenberg's life, it was really easy for me to abridge, because normally it would have run probably 40 minutes or something like that. So my abridgment included 9 characters. I was able to recruit 9 enthusiastic rhetoric scholars / very amateur voice actors in the months leading up to the conference. And I prefaced that performance with a very short version of what I've been talking through here, plus these 3 questions. To what extent is the following, meaning the presentation, a creative and or critical undertaking? How do your reactions to it, intellectual, emotional, bodily, echo or diverge from your usual reactions to conference presentations? And what possibilities for original scholarly genres or compositions might emerge based on this performance of Benjamin's extant work? So I'm still not totally sure what to make of what followed, but I want to play just the first couple minutes of the result from you. So these are the opening deliberations of the group that Benjamin's script calls the Moon Committee for Earth Research.
I hereby open the 17th session of the Moon Committee for Earth Research. I welcome the committee members, Safanti, Quicko, and Pekka. We're nearing our work's end. Now that we've sorted out Earth's essential parts, we've decided, based on many requests from the lunar public, to conduct a few additional studies of humans. From the start, it's been clear to the Commission that this is an unproductive area of research. The samples taken over the last millennia haven't yielded a single case in which a human has amounted to anything. Starting with this basic scientific fact, this meeting is concerned with proving this as a result of the unhappy human condition. Pekka would like the floor.
I'd like to speak on a procedural matter. Before we move on to other agenda items, I would like to draw the committee's attention to this lunar map based on the research of Professor Lichtenberg of Germany.
Honestly, I don't think the committee can expect much from this map. I noticed that the huge crater where we hold our meetings isn't even marked on it.
Excuse me, but who is Lichtenberg?
According to the Earth Archive, a scientist who concluded the work of Tobias Mayer, a German astronomer who died a number of years ago.
A motion that we thank Professor Lichtenberg for his interest in moon research by making him the subject of our investigation into humans.
Any objections? None raised, the motion passes. Quicko, will you tune the spectrophone to Lichtenberg's lab?
Powering up the spectrophone.
Okay, so perhaps my biggest mistake was buying kazoos for every single person who was a part of that to use for sound effects. It resulted in a few unforeseen interruptions. But anyway, so we've gone to the moon. I want to wrap this presentation up by just bringing us back down to Earth with a fairly straightforward research project focused on the classroom. So my podcasting work and the Benjamin Project have focused more on making the case for what sound can do as an experimental mode of scholarship. But I'm also interested in figuring out how to introduce teachers and students to podcasts, both as potential texts to be analyzed and as things students can create. When discussing podcasts with writing teachers, I found that a lot of them thought of podcast as synonymous with something like audio essay, which brings me back to the Hold My Mule episode of the EP that I played at the start of this presentation. As I mentioned, there are a lot of genres at work in that episode, musical genres in that case, and writing researchers and teachers have developed a really rich vocabulary for teaching and talking about genre. We've paid less attention, though, to format, which again is also a key part of what's happening with Hold My Mule, the way it was distributed and circulated, as well as how podcasts more generally are distributed and circulated. So when I talk to teachers and students about podcasts, I like to emphasize that podcasting is not a genre, right? It's not just this American lifestyle storytelling. It's a format, and it can do a whole lot more than offer just a new take on the same old kinds of essays that we've been having students write for centuries.